the Big Bang Theory, a theory that scientists now believe to be how the universe started. But how did the Big Bang create what we see here today? Well, that's what I'm here to tell you. Let's begin. If we start looking back in time, as far back as we know is 10 to the negative 43 seconds, also known as the Planck era. Just after the Big Bang, before the Planck era, we just aren't sure what happened. But how did we do this? How did we discover this? Well, first we discovered that the universe was expanding. So if we trace that, and then we trace the cosmic microwave background radiation, or CMB for short, we see that everything starts to get squished into this small spot, which leads back to the theory of the Big Bang. Now, in this diagram, it's a very simple diagram, but I think it's a good way to get the point across before we start talking about more details. So, this diagram, it shows the inflation era, which was this time in the universe where it went from the size of a proton to about the size of a baseball, which is incredible. Then 380,000 years later, atoms were formed, which this diagram shows. Then a billion years later, stars were formed, and about 14 billion years later is where we are now. And that's kind of the simple diagram we have, but let's get more detailed. We're more interested in the, seconds, the first couple seconds the universe was formed. So in this diagram, I'll be using different names, and I'll explain which ones they are, but it's the same idea. So in this diagram, we see the Planck era, which, as I explained, is as far back as we can see, and then we get the inflation era, where everything started to rapidly get bigger. All forces were united, it's hot, and particles were moving very rapidly. At 10 to the negative 36 seconds, we're still in the inflation era, so the universe is growing quickly, the forces are separating slowly. At the end of this era, there will be 4 separate forces, meaning the gravitational force, the electromagnetic force, the strong force, and the weak force will all be separated. After 10 to the negative 10 seconds, we get into the Hadron era, which, in the diagram, I believe it is called the electroweak area. The strong force is dominant in this era, and the temperature is dropping rapidly. After 10 to the negative 6 seconds, the Hadron era leaves, and we get into the lepton era, or particle era in the diagram. Electrons and neutrinos are dominant. We're down to about 10 to the 12th Kelvin, which is much cooler than where we were, and production of neurons ends. We then move on to the nucleosynthesis era, which is about 1 second after the Big Bang. We get helium and neutrinos decay into protons and electrons. From this, we start to move towards the plasma era, and it starts to form plasma. All these particles start to form together, the neutrons and the electrons, and the first thing we get is like helium and plasma. This era lasts for this plasma era lasts for about a couple thousand years or so, and we move into the atom era, where basically atoms are formed, and from there we start getting a creation of many elements. From these elements we start to get stars, and then light comes into the universe. Then from stars we get galaxies, and from galaxies we get our planets, obviously, and then that's how we get life. And that's essentially how this diagram goes and how all of this goes. And yeah, thanks. We have this video that kind of gives you a nice little rundown, I think, of all of the particles mashing together and all of that. So I'll just play this for you, and that'll be the end of this.